All right, great. Good afternoon. For those of you whom I don't know, I'm Steve Slick, the Director of the Intelligence Studies Project here at the university. On behalf of the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, the Clements Center for National Security, as well as the LBJ School's Faculty and PhD Colloquium, welcome to today's event. At the top, I want to take advantage of what is clearly a self-selected audience to promote an upcoming ISP event. So next Thursday, in this very room, we're going to host a fellow named Arturo Munoz, who's a friend of ours from Washington. He's affiliated with the RAND Corporation and also a former CIA officer. And Arturo will be discussing with us information operations and covert influence. Seems to be a topic of some interest these days. And so today, on the same theme, we're delighted to host Dr. Todd, who's going to discuss her terrific book, Operation Black Mail. Now, this book was published last fall by the Naval Institute Press. And Operation Black Mail, which I read last fall shortly after it came out, and do heartily recommend it, tells the story of a remarkable patriot, Elizabeth Betty Mcintosh, who served with great distinction with the Office of Strategic Services in the India-Burma-China theater in World War II, and then came on board with the Central Intelligence Agency, where she had a distinguished career as a specialist in information operations, psychological operations. And we partnered with the PhD Colloquium in today's event because the research that Ann did for this book was also conducted as part of her PhD program here at the University of Texas. She holds a PhD in history from the university. And so we've asked Ann today not only to tell us about Betty Mcintosh, to tell us about the OSS in the Pacific Theater, but also to tell us about the process of converting a PhD thesis into a commercial book. And an excellent one at that. So multiple audiences, multiple aims today. And Ann has agreed to stay after the talk today to sign books that will be for sale outside. So if you don't have a copy yet, this is a great opportunity to get one. And she traveled to join us today all the way from Dripping Springs, Texas. So please join me in welcoming Ann Todd.
Thank you, Steve. Can everybody hear me? I've always been a little concerned about that. It's my voice that doesn't always project. So I'm going to talk about OSS and Betty, and then when it comes to the part about publishing a book from dissertation, I'm just going to take questions and tell you anything you want to know about it. OSS, Office of Strategic Services. It's been called the precursor to the CIA, and it was. But it also gave birth not only to the CIA, but Special Forces, the National Security Agency, and all forms of psychological warfare that this country practices today. OSS was a unique experiment. It pulled people in from all walks of life to fight World War II with clandestine, covert, and paramilitary operations. It was also considered something of, quirky, fly-by-night outfit that was answerable to no one and didn't respect authority. It's my kind of club. Critics of OSS people call them things like oh-so-social, spies with ties, inmates running the asylum. My favorite definition is a PhD who could win a bar fight. I have a short list of the kind of characters that were attracted to this organization. So in addition to every ethnicity and every nationality, we had movie stars, film producers, artists, journalists, priests, dog trainers, safecrackers, members of the Canine Corps, bird watchers, carrier pigeons, and one elephant was on the rolls of OSS by the end of the war. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, December 1941, this country had no organized intelligence service. The military was not preparing for any kind of commando-style warfare, and for sure, no one was doing psychological warfare because it was considered the most distasteful of activities. Thanks to one man, William J. Donovan, Medal of Honor winner from the First World War and a lawyer, the ground had been laid for just such an organization. Donovan was not without his detractors, not least of which was most of the United States government, including but not limited to FBI, State Department, Treasury, and most of the contingent of the military command structure. But Donovan had two very important allies. Franklin Delano Roosevelt loved everything secret and cloak and dagger. And Winston Churchill wanted to set Europe ablaze with the kind of psychological warfare that the Nazis had been dishing for years. Subject to my book, Elizabeth P. Mcintosh. Betty was born in 1915 and lived to be 100 years old. She was a reporter. She served in OSS. She worked for the State Department, Voice of America, served in the CIA, long and distinguished career, wrote 2 children's books and 1 book, excellent book, on women in the OSS, which is how I found her. I knew Betty the last 5 years of her life. She often told me the 18 months she served in OSS were the very best in her life. And I wanted to know why. Because I figured if I could understand that, then I could understand this organization, this legendary organization. I'll quote Admiral William McRaven. He said, "There was just something mythical about OSS." Betty was the daughter of 2 newspaper reporters. She grew up in Hawaii, and in high school she was what I would call a popular loner. She was editor of the yearbook. She was captain of the tennis team, obviously very attractive. Her teachers all thought she was bright but incredibly mischievous. And but at the end of the day, she would walk home alone and spend time with her very best friend, Daisy the elephant, at the zoo. When she graduated from the University of Washington with a journalism degree, her father hired her at the Honolulu Advertiser and put her on the sports desk. She loathed the sports desk. She contrived to get herself tossed off it by deliberately misspelling the name of Hawaii's native son, the famous swimmer Duke Kahanamoko. It's kind of a pattern in her life. One good thing to come from the sports desk, she met her future husband, Alexander McDonald. They were brought together by a mutual love of all things Japanese. And after they got married in 1940, while their house was being built by a young, little-known architect named Philip Johnson, they lived with Professor Watanabe and his wife so that they could immerse themselves in all things traditional Japanese and become fluent in the language. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Betty was making breakfast in their new house. Alex put on his uniform. He was a second lieutenant in the Naval Reserve, and she didn't see him again for 2 weeks. Of course, everyone's life changed that day. Betty went from being a local reporter on a local newspaper to a war correspondent. Scripps Howard News Service picked her up as a stringer. So she started writing, and she wrote some excellent copy in the weeks and months to come. But the Army had slapped down a lid of censorship on the entire Hawaiian archipelago, and they weren't letting anything out. She tried everything. She sent her articles to friends on the mainland, and they would get these pieces of paper with huge holes cut out, just the random conjunction left. She hitched a ride on a sampan to deliver medicines to the lepers on Molokai. She climbed an erupting volcano and wrote about that. The Army felt that if the Japanese read about that volcano, then they'd be able to get line of sight on the lava and do a bombing run, as though the Japanese didn't know where Hawaii was by that time. Then, to make matters much, much worse, she found out that Alex was one of the censors working for naval intelligence, and the mother of all marital battles ensued. Just in time, Scripps Howard offered her a job in Washington, D.C., covering the Eleanor Roosevelt White House. So she was there in a heartbeat. She threw herself into that job, and it amounted to writing for, she did interview Ms. Roosevelt multiple times, which was cool, but she basically was writing about women's issues, specifically rationing. So after a few months of writing about how much copper could be saved from melting down hooks and eyes, and how much nickel silver could be saved by removing it from sunglasses, she once again was growing very frustrated. That's when she was approached by an OSS recruiter, seemingly out of the mist, because that's what they did, they just appeared. And of course he knew she spoke Japanese. He said, "How would you like to work for the government? It would be secret, possibly dangerous, and we'll probably send you to Asia." So she reported to OSS headquarters the minute they would let her in the gate. While being fingerprinted the first day for her ID, she met a woman who would become her best bud and partner in crime, Jane Foster. When I wrote my dissertation, it was actually called Betty and Jane. But Jane got moved to the background for this book, and she'll reappear in my next one. Jane was an artist of international repute, known for her caricatures and collages. And she acquired her fluency in Malay, which is, Donovan poached her from the Board of Economic Warfare because she could speak Malay, which was the lingua franca, not only of Malaysia, but of Indonesia. She acquired this ability while enduring an unhappy marriage to a Dutch colonial official in Batavia, which is now Jakarta. This is just one of her sketches. This is her personal servant. His name was Dog. She tried to call him other things, but he liked his name. Betty and Jane were recruited into a new OSS branch, Morale Operations. Today, we would call it Influence Operations or Information Operations. The mission of Morale Operations was to deceive and demoralize the enemy. In this case, the Japanese, or anyone that was collaborating with the Japanese. As I mentioned, psychological warfare was not a popular weapon in the U.S. arsenal. But the British made it clear that it had to be part of the overall strategy. So, one man stepped forward and agreed to take it on. Donovan was faced with a dilemma, though. He didn't know who to recruit. No one had ever trained anyone in psychological warfare in this country. So he decided to pull together creative types, artists, journalists, linguists, and anthropologists, people who had an expertise in the various areas that the Japanese had occupied. And so, again, I have another little short list here of what ended up washing up into the East Asia contingent of Morale Operations. In addition to Betty and Jane, we had a Chinese artist, a Shanghai businessman, a private detective, the producer of the Lucky Strike hit parade, an Olympic broad jump champion, a patent medicine salesman, and missionaries, my favorite of which is the elderly Miss Lucy Starling, who demanded to be allowed to jump into northern Thailand and set up an MO shop. She could field strip a machine gun blindfolded in seconds. The main tool of morale operations was black propaganda. Black propaganda goes to point of origin. You fake a newspaper in Delhi to make it look like it rolled off the press in Honshu province in Japan. You make a broadcast pose as though it's Radio Tokyo, when really it's being transmitted from a hand crank generator in Chittagong. I always explain this by saying Tokyo Rose did not practice black propaganda. Didn't matter what she said or if she lied. The point is she was really in Tokyo. So that wasn't black propaganda. So this is an example. This is just a poem that was put to verse to induce the Japanese to surrender. This is a proposal to put messages in matchboxes, again, to either induce surrender or to deceive, you know. The thing is, the Japanese, then as now, loved all things beautiful, especially in everyday life, no matter how small. So the idea was to create these matchbooks and put messages inside them. So for a project like this, you had to have the right ink, the right paper, the right kanji script. This is the message that went inside. And the language had to be right, had to be the kind of colloquial Japanese that an everyday person would use. You had to have all these things, and you had to get it right. You had to even hand carve the matchsticks the way they did it in Japan. The Japanese were not stupid people, and they would immediately pick up on something that looked like, you know, it came from Cincinnati. I will get to Burma in a minute. So the projects piled up in the file cabinet, and the MO contingent thought, we're never going to get there. But finally they received their orders to go to the China-Burma-India theater. Then as now, people didn't even know the China-Burma-India theater existed, let alone that there were Americans there. So to give you a little backstory, when the Japanese invaded, and let's make this work, when the Japanese invaded in 1942, they unpacked collapsible bicycles and rode them up the Malay Peninsula into Burma. They occupied Rangoon, which is there somewhere. Rangoon, yeah, there it is. Then this is Mutaguchi's 15th Army. When they got to Rangoon, the army split. And Lieutenant General Tanaka, go back, took his forces and went up here and captured Myitkyina and took the airfield so that he could harass British Spitfires and the Hump pilots. General Sato headed up to India, where he would invade, occupy, and then cross over and hook up with the Germans in the Middle East. Funny thing happened when Sato got up there to India. The British Army, with their Indian Army, defeated the Japanese on the plain of Imphal and turned them back. Sato messaged Mutaguchi and said, "Our swords are broken, we're going home." Which was kind of unprecedented for a Japanese commander. So they turned around and they started back. And at this point, you need to understand, how many here have been to Burma? Okay, so you know that, you know, the highlands coming down this way, Burma goes like this. It's like somebody took the country and just squished it. And so in the morning, you can be on the jungle floor where it's steamy and humid and hot and awful. And then when you pitch your tent at night, you can be above the timberline, freezing. So now when the Japanese were going north, they were on the offensive. They were on the move. Their supply lines were strong, well-fed, morale was up. Coming back, they were exhausted and defeated and down to one rice ball a day. So you have to imagine these Japanese soldiers getting increasingly haggard. They began getting sick. They had dysentery. They got that horrible malaria, cerebral malaria that can kill you like in 2 hours. They had deadly snakes. The two-step crepe was called that because if it bit you, you might make 2 steps before you dropped. So they're malnourished, they're sick, they're starting to hallucinate. Going single file, they would look to the right and the left, off in the dark jungle, and they would see huge striped tigers keeping pace. And the tigers would leisurely pick off the Japanese, and they were getting fatter and fatter. And these tigers, normally, they would have to take down a water buffalo. So these Japanese soldiers were like chicken McNuggets to them. Even the old tigers, the ones with bad teeth, they were flourishing. So imagine how terrifying that was. Then they would go through Burmese villages, and the villagers took great delight describing to them the weird tiger, which is half human, half tiger, nocturnal, and of course impervious to bullets. So the point of all this is that by the time Betty arrived in theater in July of 1944, her target for demoralization were these sick, spooked, and already half demoralized Japanese soldiers. Meanwhile, forgot to mention, Detachment, OSS Detachment 101 was up in North Burma. That's a whole nother story. The book is Troy Sackety, Detachment 101. It's a great book. So, Detachment 101 was teaching the mountain people how to use modern weaponry to kill Japanese. These are the Kachin mountain people. And they had a robust warrior culture, but they were basically using muskets and spears. So the Det 101 guys equipped them with M1 Garands and Springfields and taught them how to use them. These gentlemen are the Naga headhunters. They had a fierce reputation as headhunters, and so there was high hopes for them. But when the Detachment 101 guys tried to work with them, they found them to be gentle, jolly folk, really not interested in killing anything, and so they couldn't light a fire under them. They basically gave up. So one day, the Det 101 guys are taking their midday meal outside, and a group of the Naga that they had been trying to train came jogging up and dumped a gunny sack full of Japanese heads on the lunch table. The Americans lost their lunch and thereafter left the Naga to their own strategies and tactics. So in addition to the snakes, the tigers, and all the other things the Japanese were facing, these guys were coming out of the jungle and lopping off their heads and carrying them off and probably eating them, I don't know. When the MO contingent got to the theater, it split. And Betty and her crew went to Delhi. Jane and her friends went down to Ceylon, and that was Detachment 404. Here you have Donovan, and the tall officer there is Colonel Coughlin. He was the CEO of Detachment 404. Also in Detachment 404 was future celebrities chef Julia Child. She and Betty remained lifelong friends. Betty never introduced Julia without saying, and when I knew the woman, she couldn't boil water. Paul Child, lumberjack, judo expert, artist. Paul did these amazing three-dimensional topographical maps for any commander in the theater that needed them for their war room. There's one still on display at CIA headquarters. Dylan Ripley. Dillon was a longtime head of the Smithsonian Institution. He was an ornithologist, a bird watcher. And when he went into OSS here, he was a brand new PhD. Now, if Dillon heard the sound of the triple-breasted thrush, he would wander off into the jungle, and people would have to go find him and bring him back. When he wasn't doing that, he was running secret operations, secret intelligence operations down into northern Thailand. This dangerous crew, that's Betty. This is a British officer next to her, and that's another British, you can tell he's British. This is her friend Bill Magistrati, fellow Japanese linguist. That's her dog Angel Puss. Everywhere she went, she rescued a dog. This grumpy guy is her dog Walla. The British made it clear when the Americans got to India, you must have Wallas. You have to have your tea Walla, your laundry Walla, and the dog Wallas were the lowest of the low. Probably why he doesn't look, all that happy. The first project in India for Betty was called Operation Black Mail. As I mentioned before, to do black propaganda, you have to have stuff. You have to have equipment. When Betty first arrived, she didn't have rice paper, the right vegetable dye inks, the right brushes for the kanji script. She had nothing. Nothing arrived. She had one box of typewriter ribbon and no typewriter. The British had everything. The British didn't like the Americans. They felt, rightly so, that the Americans wanted to take their empire away from them and give it to the subject people of the colonies. So Betty, in her inimitable way, turned on the charm. And she traded her gin ration, her cigarette ration. She agreed to the tough duty of going dancing every night, having gin and tonics, playing endless games of tennis. It was, it was tough duty, but she got everything she needed. But the first project didn't require any of that, because the British, in exchange for a carton of cigarettes, said, we've got this captured mail sack. It was really gross and mildewing damp. They said, you can dip your hand in that, and anything you pull out, you can use. She pulled out a stack of postcards that had been addressed by soldiers in Burma to go home to their wives and mothers in Japan. And the great thing about it is this little dealie right here is the censor's chop, which means it had been cleared all along the way. It was in the mail stream. So Betty and her friends, with the help of the British, took these postcards, and fortunately they were written in pencil. So they erased the kanji script and put them back in the mail stream. They hired a Burmese agent to, go do that, go kill somebody and plant it in a mail bag. So, to give you an example, Betty would take a postcard and she would erase the loving message that the young soldier had written to his wife and replace it with, Dear Keiko, the situation here has become unbearable. The war is lost. Do not believe what the government is telling you. I myself have fallen in love with a Kachin maiden and have been welcomed into her village, where I will remain when my unit moves on. Please, go on without me. Your loving husband, Yoki. Now, this operation went so well that Betty started slicing off pieces of opium and paying these Burmese agents to get out there and kill the Japanese mail couriers, take their bags. And so, for example, correspondence coming the other way from a young wife to her husband in Japan, from Japan to Burma. Betty would erase that and have the young wife describe how she was having to sleep with corrupt local officials in order to increase the food ration because the children had already cinched up their belt 3 times. But don't worry about us, we're fine here. Wicked, right? This is a faked bombing of Japan that they dropped leaflets, I think from the Spitfire. They're just convincing the Japanese that, this is what's happening to their friends and relatives back on the home islands. Threatening headman letter. When the Japanese were on the march going to India, a lot of the village headmen threw in their lot with them because they were winning. Well, so they had to be flipped back the other way. So Betty had them forge a threat letter. Well, it wasn't forged, it was just a threat letter. And it basically says, "Dear headman, we learned that your fellow headman, who this was addressed to, was helping the Japanese. This is his blood, you are next." And she, they spread those things on the floor, they pricked their fingers and did the blood on them, walked on them for a few days, and then had them delivered around to the various headmen. These boys are the Kippy Thai. They were the counterparts for Betty and the rest of morale operations. So you got to understand, you got people like Betty and Jane and the Birdwatcher coming up with these schemes. These guys had gone to college to do nothing but learn how to do that, how to demoralize and how to fake things and learn languages and all that sort of thing. This is the Burma Road. It's the lifeline to China before the Japanese cut it in 1942. It went from the railhead in Lido in Burma all the way to Kunming, China. It's also an exact replica of my driveway. In the spring of 1945, Betty was ordered to deploy to Kunming. So she couldn't take the Burma Road, she had to fly the hump. Okay, you can see it right there. She flew a C-47 from Dum Dum Airport in Calcutta over the southern Himalayas to Kunming. The hump, I'm sure you've all heard about it. It's a 481-mile gauntlet through needle-like mountain peaks. Most of the planes couldn't go above the mountain peaks. They had to fly between them. And it was deadly. She was terrified, and rightly so. This is a C-47 that went down with all hands. She could look down and see what they call the aluminum trail, which was so many planes had gone down that was literally a trail through the mountain passes that she could look at. Well, they gave her this to sew inside of her jacket. This is a blood chit. It says, "Help this American. He's a friend." So she sewed it inside of her flight jacket. Kunming was on the top of a 7,000-foot plateau. So Betty was behind enemy lines because all around the base of this plateau were Japanese. It was also the home of the Flying Tigers. When they had to evacuate out of Rangoon, they set up their base in Kunming. Here's Claire Chenault, famous leader of the Flying Tigers. This is Colonel Richard Hepner. He was the CO of OSS Detachment 202 in Kunming. And this is Betty with his dog, Sammy. As I said, Betty always had a dog. Sammy was brought over the Burma Road before it closed, and the GI that was driving shared his gin ration with him. Sammy developed a taste for gin. And to the end of his long life, when Betty had her martini in the evening, he took his in a saucer. Sammy was also in love with Agnes the war dog, a big Doberman that lived in a little war dog encampment. Every morning, Sammy would take his tennis ball to Agnes. Agnes wasn't having any of it. This is Betty putting together something with a helper. China was different. Whereas in Burma, they sat around and they came up with evil schemes. In China, it was a regular operation where they had magazines that went out on a periodic basis, and newspapers. And so they would print them there in Kunming and send them out to all the OSS field bases, that were all over China, connected like the tentacles of an octopus. This is a proposal for a poem to put in one of those magazines. These are a couple of her colleagues. Kunming flooded that summer, big flood. Right after this, a sergeant picked Betty up and threw her in the water because she had sewn his stripes on upside down when he got promoted. Now, you may know, the British stopped the war every day for tea. The Americans, the OSS Americans, had parties. So at least once a week, they would print up these invitations. They would all put on whatever formal attire they could put together, and they'd have a dance. Big thing of bathtub gin. OSS was disbanded October 1st, 1945. But before that happened, the last week in July, Betty stopped at the black radio station in Kunming for coffee. The scriptwriter, Cy Nadler, was stomping around in a total swivet because he couldn't come up with a good idea that would really upset the Japanese on the home islands. Betty says, how about you say the first week in August there's going to be a great catastrophe. You know, something from the sky with fire. Nadler goes, the equivalent of, no, that's so lame. So she's like, fine, she went off. He decided he had nothing better, so he put that over the airwaves with one of his prognosticators. It was beamed into Japan. Betty got on a plane, went to Chongqing, came back August 6th, walked in and found out that her great catastrophe from the sky had happened. And her CO wanted to see her. It's okay. She ended up marrying him. You know, she always got herself out of trouble that way. Betty stayed an extra month in China and wrote the history of morale operations in China. This is her a few years later. Bill Donovan's grave. Up behind her would be Claire Chennault, Bill Magistretti, two of her husbands. Here she is at age 98. If only I could look that good. Here she is with the OSS flag. We lost her in June of 2015, but before that, the CIA had brought her in for her 100th birthday and brought her up to the executive dining room, fed her favorite chocolate cake, and really made her day. I'd love to answer questions. Yes, ma'am.
What happened to that first husband that was in the Navy Reserves?
You know, he decided, she got him into OSS. He ended up down in Bangkok. In fact, he accepted the Japanese surrender there. He became real infatuated with Bangkok and decided to stay. She didn't want to. It was an amicable split. They stayed friends their whole lives. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
What was her CIA role when she was part of that organization?
Well, the one I know about is right after the war, while she was married to Dick Hepner, she wrote a children's book. Hepner died. He dropped dead of a heart attack in the Pentagon. And Alan Dulles called her in and said, how would you like to come back into the family? And so he had her book translated into Japanese, and he sent her to Japan to be a case officer undercover as a children's author, which she was. So as I understand it, the best cover is, as much truth as possible. So, yes, sir.
Were there comparable groups to hers in Europe and the rest of Asia?
Oh, yes. I should have mentioned, morale operations in Europe was a big deal. They were not under-provisioned. They were not ignored. They had all the help they needed and all the materials they needed. And they ran some wonderful operations where one woman in particular convinced an entire contingent of, I think it was Czech soldiers fighting for the Germans, to surrender en masse. So very successful operations there.
Just a follow-up, did they have a best practices technique where they could share what worked and what didn't work around the world?
Well, morale operations in China, Burma, India was so out of touch that they were going on simultaneously. So no, there wasn't a chance for lessons learned or any of that. Betty and her crew literally just made things up as they went along, most of which Washington didn't agree with, because Washington the Joint Chiefs were adamant, the Japanese will never surrender. They can't. It's not in their DNA. The British were saying the Japanese are too stupid, simple, or not even human enough to be deceived into surrendering. So Betty just quit asking, no permission. They just went about their business, and they got away with it because there was no good communication. Yes, sir?
Is there any evidence that any of this worked?
Yes. JB1, false surrender order. First, let me preface that by saying part of the frustration of this work was, as I said in my book, it's opaque on both ends. You think you know who you're targeting, but you're not sure. And on the other end, you don't know if they ever even get the stuff. But JB1, Betty decided that indeed the Japanese could be convinced to surrender. So she got the help of a Japanese POW, Mr. Okamoto, and they drafted a fake surrender order that basically said, under the following conditions, you can surrender, save yourself to fight another day, that sort of thing. She paid an agent to kill a courier and plant these orders in his document bag. And at the end of the war, they were walking out of the jungle with these things in their hands. So that was an example of, this worked, which was rare. Lights.
Congratulations for the wonderful work that you're doing. I would like to hear your opinion about what do you think Kashmir, Betty's time, she was active about the nature of psychological warfare. What she would say if she would be alive today and kind of observe what's going on?
Well, I'm guessing, but I have a feeling that it's become very, Steve could speak to this, become very institutionalized, and there's standard operating procedures, and they don't pull in crazy bird watchers flying by the seat of their pants. I'm guessing it's nowhere as good. Frankly.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am?
I'll take advantage of Steve's suggestion and ask about the process of turning your dissertation into a book. How did you go about it? What were the pitfalls?
Well, first of all, you have to know that's what you want. A lot of people, they want to get that dissertation done so they can get tenure or at least hired now. I knew I didn't want to go into academia. So it was real important for me to get a committee that would agree to let me write a book that, although it satisfied all the, primary source stuff for a dissertation, that it's not something that only scholars would read. And so, once you do that, nothing's easy about it. I mean, I had briefly, the best agent in the world, Jim Hornfisher. He's local here. Jim is, he's a rocket scientist of an agent. He worked with me for 4 months trying to get a proposal that, as he put it, the big boys would take. Knopf, Random House, those ones. Hatchet. They all read it. They all had nice things to say about it, but there wasn't enough violence. There was no sex, so they all took a pass. Fortunately, Naval Institute kind of straddles both worlds of commercial and scholarly. I was in the Coast Guard, so I loved them anyway, because, they are the press of the sea services. So, and they published Betty's book on women in the OSS. So, see, I got cuts and breaks there that most people don't. You got to get somebody that will read your dissertation, tell you if you can put together a really good proposal, help you do that. The proposal is what sells it. You do a proposal, sample chapters, cast of characters, things like that. That has to be really good. So, there you go. Anybody else? Steve?
I found fascinating, much in the book, of course, but one thing I was hoping you'd mention was the Vietnamese visitor to the OSS operation in China down there.
Mr. Ho Chi Minh?
Just briefly tell that story. This is, the walk-ons in this book are absolutely incredible.
He's right. Buy it for that. The walk-ons are incredible. Ho Chi Minh. So there were strict rules. Let's set the stage here. There were strict rules in Kunming about where you could eat. You weren't supposed to go to certain out-of-bound restaurants or you would get horrible diseases. They all went to those restaurants. Betty's favorite was one where they served this lovely lime sherbet. And she found out later that what made it so good is the key ingredient was Vicks Vapor Rub. So she agreed to go to this restaurant just to get her sherbet. And she went with some of the special operations guys. And they were all just real serious, as those guys were. Operational group, they were like today's Green Berets, I guess. Took themselves pretty seriously, rightly so. So here she is at this big table, and there's this little Asian man there, and they're all ignoring him. And so she starts talking to him. He could speak English, and he had a very soft demeanor. And she just chatted with him about things like, the American Declaration of Independence, how cool it was. And they continued to ignore him until he said something, and then they all perked up. But that was Ho Chi Minh. That was the walk-on of Ho Chi Minh in her life. And she always felt, we really should have been nicer to that guy. Maybe he wouldn't have turned so mean, kind of thing. Anybody else? Oh, yes.
How did she explain her presence there as an American in that area? Was it just, it was an American base and the people in the surrounding area didn't question?
Oh, in China?
Yeah.
Yeah, Americans were all over the place. Yeah, it was an American base. And although the Japanese were all over in the country, Chongqing and Kunming were being held by, the Allies. So. She also met, who's the guy? John Birch. John Birch. She couldn't stand that guy. She said, he was on some kind of mission, and it had nothing to do with OSS, so I had no use for him. So. Steve?
Yeah, just one last one from me on the sort of your understanding or treatment of the different approaches to gender in big military and in the OSS and this these kinds of innovations and flexibility and adaptation, all the opportunities that folks like Betty had in the OSS. Have you given thought or considered
Really?
academically what was different about the OSS that created these opportunities for women that didn't exist in the rest of the Army?
First of all, Donovan, although he loved the ladies, when it came to the work of OSS, I contend he was gender blind. You know, if he needed something done and a woman had the skills, she got to do it. You know, I don't know if y'all are familiar with Virginia Hall. She was an OSS heroine who trained a lot of Maquis, French resistance and whatnot. And, you know, women in OSS, if they were determined and they had the right skill set, the right language. For example, Jane, at the end of the war, Jane was literally dropped into Indonesia before the Japanese had even surrendered and had to basically liberate a POW camp. You know, a woman. They had to force her to learn how to fire a pistol before, you know, she went. So if you had, this is the unique thing about OSS, unlike the military, if you had special skills, you could find a place. The other thing is, back then, women, no matter if they had a PhD, they were all called girls, the girls. And Betty said, if you had a problem with that, tough, because she never took offense. None of her friends took offense. That's just how it was. So now that wouldn't fly so much. Does that answer that?
Yes, yeah.
Yes, ma'am?
Could you shed a little bit of light on the tensions between Betty's operations in India and the OWL, like the OWL?
Yeah, they didn't like each other.
Yeah. Did they ever cooperate any? They seem like. Yeah.
Who was that? Who was the owl?
You're talking about the the ones that told the truth. My God, I'm pulling a blank. There was OSS and the other ones that their propaganda was white. They told the truth and they were very proud of that. And they didn't like, you know, when Donovan's organization was set up, that group split off because they thought black propaganda was evil and immoral. Betty got more cooperation out of the British than she did those folks. So, and they did have the equipment she needed. Yeah, they were creepy. I'm not partial or anything. There's somebody else back there had their hand up. Oh, yes, sir.
I'm sorry, one last from me again. It will be a little bit more about the academic transformation. What is your feeling? Would you describe how did the PhD dissertation has been transformed into a commercial book, or you have to judge the degree of conversion, if you will? How much did you have to work on that in order to make it a story?
Actually, again, I have to credit my my committee. I had H.W. Brands. Y'all read his stuff? I mean, it's just like reading a novel. So, you know, they were all amenable to me, basically. When I went into my dissertation defense, you know, I'm all nervous and ready. And the first thing they wanted to talk about was casting. Who's going to play Betty? Who's gonna play? I'm like, what? And then they got in an argument about it. You know, one of them said, "Oh, it's Meryl Streep," and the other goes, "No, she's too old." No, she's not. Yeah. So, to answer your question, basically, I took that dissertation and made it into exactly what I wanted it to be without losing the documentation. Wasn't that hard, really? Wasn't.
Thank you very much, Mia.
But you got to start with people who share your vision for that. Yes, sir?
Who's going to play Betty?
I think Sandra Bullock could pull it off. She's had work. Okay, she can play a 30-something, don't you think? I think so. Yes.
As long as we're all doing second rounds, was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of the other cameos, walk-ons. I know Margaret Mead was active in the area. Any other names that we'd recognize?
Well, Margaret Mead, Betty had sat in on lectures from Margaret Mead back in Washington, found them very helpful. Margaret Mead's husband, Gregory Bateson, was part of the crew. Just like Dylan Ripley, he was an anthropologist. If they didn't watch him, he would wander off and observe the breastfeeding habits of the natives, and they'd have to go retrieve him. He could get lost in a closet, you know, but he could come up with brilliant morale operation schemes. So there's Gregory. Yeah.
The OSS roster's legendary. New York Yankees catcher, Mo Bird.
I've got John Wayne's application to OSS, you know, and their argument was, you're too recognizable. Well, come on. I mean, Sterling Hayden was an OSS. He was recognizable, right? So I think they just didn't want John Wayne. Marion, whatever his name was.
Yeah.
Ian Fleming, I've got a memo that he sent to Donovan telling him, Ian Fleming, you know, James Bond, telling him, here's who you need to get in an OSS. Men, mature, but young enough, serious, not rule breakers or risk takers. Donovan goes and hires 4,500 women, lots of young men, lots of men in their 40s and 50s, women in their 30s, definitely not serious. So there's Ian Fleming. Yes, sir.
Maybe I'll bring your discussion to something that's a little current. With all the women that were in the OSS and being sent to various locations, cohabiting with men in terms of work, were there any abuse issues similar to what we have today? And if there weren't, why do you think that is?
Oh, again, well, of course there were. I mean, there have been since, Adam and Eve. But
The other way.
yeah, Betty never had problems with men. She never talked about women that had problems with men. But again, OSS was unique. A bunch of very liberal people, who were ahead of their time in terms of any kind of issue, thought outside of every box there was. So I can't speak to it, but my guess is that, compared to the military, for example, I'm guessing there wasn't as much of an issue. But I don't know.
Just curious, numbers-wise and everything, when you look like retention, what's the percentage of people who maybe washed out during the original training, then washed out, maybe they got on the assignment and, I don't know, I guess they get sent home if it doesn't work out, and plus how many people, the casualty rate, do you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the thing about OSS is they had no blueprint. So Donovan initiated this recruitment word of mouth, and starting with his associates at his law firm, Princeton, and people who knew people, and the waves of recruitment, it was like somebody tossed a rock and it just it went out like this. At one point, so many people were being brought in that they were getting every nutcase, every rich kid who wanted to get an immediate commission without going through training. And so Donovan's people grabbed him and said, stop, you've got to stop, you're out of control, we've got to have a vetting process. He goes, okay, you've got a month, get it going. And they did. They pulled in psychiatrists and they came up with a program. But before that, like Paul Child's letters, he describes all the people that he saw come through. He goes, it is just, you know, rogues gallery of One Flew Over the Cuckoo Nest. So, a lot of people washed out after they got a vetting process going. Did that answer your question?
But once, let's say, did they wash out, let's say, I understand there was some training that goes on. Did a huge number of people wash out in training, or did it have to wait until they got to their overseas and then find out, okay, this person's a misfit, he's
Yeah.
gonna get us killed, get him out of here?
Yeah, a lot of that misfit thing happened before the training process. Once that got put in place, they were able to get rid of them before they went too far. But again, even then, compared to the rigorous vetting that goes on in other services, plenty of unconventional people remained. Oh, yes, sir.
Where did you get your source information?
Well, I moved to the DC area so that I could be near Betty, and just did hundreds of hours of interviews with her, combed the National Archives. I basically lived in the National Archives and the Library of Congress for 3 years. Interviews with other OSS people and CIA people.
And how long did it take you to gather up all of it?
I'd say 5 years.
Okay.
Yeah, 5 years. I had a lot done before I actually moved up there. I was basically commuting up to the archives and decided that was pretty stupid. Yes, ma'am?
Yes, I'm curious about your commercially published book. I'm wondering how you decided what names were publishable and what names of persons you wouldn't want to include because there might be legal concerns or something.
Well, that's an important point. If you're going to write a book about people, you need to get all the permissions for every photograph. Now, anything in the National Archives is, you know, public, is open to the public. You can use it. But I had to get permission to use Paul Child's papers, Julia Child's papers, photographs. I had to make Betty sign an ironclad thing that said I could reproduce any photograph she gave me and use her material. That's real important. If you don't do that, and then all of a sudden you're this close to a book contract and they go, oh, where's your permissions, by the way? You're like, what permissions? And then you got to start begging people, you know. So that's real important. That answer your question?
No, sort of, yeah. I mean, what if there's somebody whose name's there and they're long since dead? I mean.
Estates.
What?
Estates. The estates of that person. You know, I mean, this is America. You can write books, even about dead people. But if you want to use images or something that of that person's that's being held by an estate, you need to find those things out. And private collections and whatnot. That still didn't answer your question.
Well, I mean, it's, I don't know.
She's thinking about revealing names of people.
What?
What if there was somebody who was not a significant person who was interesting, but you didn't want to print their name because you didn't have permission? Could you just change their name?
No, I mean, you can write about them. You can say whatever you want about them. But if you use their property, you've got to get permission. See what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, somebody over here? Yes.
Yeah, I'll take the last question then if we're going to wrap up. I'm not sure if you were serious about your next project, whether it involves Jane Foster, but do you want to say a word about her? Preview
Well,
that. There's some controversy at the end, if I remember that.
In some of my presentations, I go on a little bit about all the mischief that Betty and Jane got into. Jane was a wonderful, happy-go-lucky woman, a prankster. And so But the fact is that Betty went on to a career in the CIA. Jane was indicted for multiple counts of espionage for spying for the Soviet NKVD. France refused to extradite her, so she spent her days barricaded in her apartment till the day she died. Very sad. The thing is, Betty always maintained she was innocent, and the French agreed. And I have my own opinions on that, which you will have to buy my book to read.
We agree to do that. Let's say thank you.